All right, diving back into Atomic Habits with you again. You know, it's funny how these classic books, you can revisit them and it's like they have something new to offer every time. What was it that made you want to unpack these excerpts again this time around?
Oh, absolutely. I think our own journeys change, and then when we go back to these familiar concepts, it's like seeing them with fresh eyes. It's pretty cool.
It is. And I gotta say, for me, this time, Clear's own story really struck a chord, you know? Talk about practicing what you preach. I mean, a near-death experience, broken nose, double vision. To go from that to becoming an academic All-American, that's some serious willpower, serious habit building.
Yeah, no kidding.
But, you know, it wasn't like this overnight transformation, and that's what gets me every time. It's the tiny changes, right? Those small things, but when you build them up over time, they just snowball into these incredible results.
That's it. That's the beauty of it. I think there's a saying about that, like, we overestimate what we can do in a year, but underestimate what we can do in a decade.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of the habit loop, right? It reminds us that even those small actions, like you said, if they're repeated consistently over time, man, they can create some pretty remarkable outcomes.
So true. Okay, so let's break down this habit loop a bit.
Yeah.
We know it's like the backbone of Claire's whole system, right? Cue, craving, response, reward. But for someone who's maybe familiar with those 4 stages already, what's like a nuance they might have missed, something that adds, I don't know, a new layer of understanding?
Ooh, that's a good question. Let me think. One thing that I think sometimes gets overlooked is how, like, deeply rooted this loop actually is in our evolutionary history. Think about our ancestors. For them, like, hearing a rustling in the bushes wasn't just a sound, it was a potential cue for food. It was survival.
So you're saying like our brains are basically hardwired to constantly be on the lookout for these cues and rewards. No
Exactly.
wonder we like reach for the cookie jar without even thinking, huh?
Right. It all comes back to those primal instincts. And that's, I think, why just intellectually understanding the habit loop isn't enough. We have to really become aware of the specific cues and the rewards that are driving our own individual habits, especially the ones that we're trying to change.
Which brings us to the habit scorecard, right? That's where the rubber meets the road. No more autopilot. But how would you recommend someone uses this tool effectively? Especially if they've, maybe tried it before. Any tips to make it less of a checklist and more of an aha moment?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's not just about, like, listing out your habits, right? It's about, digging a little deeper, asking yourself, okay, what's the cue here? What's the reward that my brain is really chasing? And don't be afraid to get curious about the ones that seem really small, those tiny little routines, because those are often the ones that pack a bigger punch than we realize.
Oh, totally. It's like those Japanese railway workers Clear talks about with their whole point and call system.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Like at first glance, you think, really, is that necessary? But then you see how dramatically it reduces errors. And it's like, wow, what could my own point and call system be for my habits?
Totally. It's about bringing those unconscious actions into the light,
Mm.
bringing that awareness to them. Now, once we've kind of identified those habits that, maybe we want to tweak a little bit, that's where environment design comes in, which I think is so crucial. Because we're not really fighting against our brains here. We're just trying to optimize these spaces that we live in to actually work with them, not against them.
And this is the part where I always think about my kitchen counter. Because seriously, if there's a cookie jar sitting there, it's game over. So, I mean, Clear's point about those subtle environmental cues is so spot on. But beyond, like, hiding the cookies, what are some other, I don't know, more creative ways someone could actually redesign their space to support their goals?
I love that you brought up the cookies because it speaks to the power of visual cues, right? Because we're bombarded with information all day long. So making the cues for your desired habits obvious it's huge, right? Like, want to read more.
Yeah.
Put a book on your pillow in the morning. You're going to see it right away. Or trying to drink more water. Get yourself a really nice water bottle that you love and keep it filled on your desk. Just those little things.
It's almost like you're setting up these little reminders throughout your day, to kind of nudge yourself in the right direction.
Totally, yeah.
But then there's the flip side of that, right? There's the Goldilocks rule where we need that sweet spot of challenge. But how can someone tell if they're like in that zone, especially if they're just starting out with a new habit?
That's a great question. Because that Goldilocks zone, you're right, that's where the magic happens.
Yeah.
It can be tricky to find at first. I think a good way to think about it is, those moments where you get so engrossed in an activity that time just seems to disappear?
Oh, yeah.
That sense of flow, that's your cue. If the task feels boring, it's probably too easy. If it feels overwhelming, you're like, dial back the challenge a little bit. It's about finding that sweet spot where you're engaged but not defeated, you know?
Makes sense. And speaking of challenges, let's talk about that instant gratification monster that we're all, kind of battling with because our brains are wired to prioritize the now, not the, maybe someday.
Yeah.
So how do we kind of bridge that gap? How do we make those future rewards feel as, I don't know, as tangible and as tempting as that cookie in the present moment?
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? I mean, it was where making it satisfying comes in. Easier said than done, for sure. One thing Claire talks about is temptation bundling. So the idea is to pair something that you enjoy with a habit that you're trying to build. So, for example, let's say you want to watch your favorite show. Well, tell yourself you can only watch it while you're on the treadmill.
Oh, I like that. It's like you're tricking your brain into associating something, enjoyable with something that you might otherwise resist. I love it. But Clear also dives into some, deeper stuff too, like how our habits actually shape our identity.
Yeah.
And that feels, I don't know, kind of huge.
Oh, it's huge because it's not just about, doing the habit. It's about embodying the type of person who does that habit. Like it's the difference between saying, I'm trying to work out more and saying I am an athlete.
Huh.
You know, it's a different mindset.
So the more we act in alignment with that desired identity, the more it kind of like ingrains itself, right?
Exactly. The feedback loop. Right.
Yeah.
So, if you want to build a habit of, let's say, writing every day, don't just focus on the act of writing.
Mm.
Focus on becoming the type of person who shows up consistently for their craft, the type of person who embraces the identity of a writer.
It's almost like those small actions, they become like little votes for the kind of person you want to be, right?
Weirdly.
So instead of like, oh, I have to go meditate, it's I meditate because, well, that's who I am.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a really powerful shift.
It is powerful, and
Yeah.
and it can make all the difference, I think. It's that aligning of your actions with your aspirations. Like, how do we bridge that gap from the person we are today to the person we want to be?
And as we're kind of, wrapping up our deep dive here into Atomic Habits, is there, I don't know, one key takeaway, like one golden nugget of wisdom that you hope our listeners, really walk away with today?
One thing that really stuck with me, and Clear emphasizes this throughout the book, is this idea that you don't have to do these things, you get to do them.
Oh, I like that.
And it's subtle, right? It's just this shift in perspective, but it's so profound. You get to wake up early and pursue your passion. You get to nourish your body with healthy food. You get to challenge your mind and learn something new. So my challenge to our listeners today is this. How can you start to view your habits as opportunities rather than obligations? How can you embrace that journey of becoming the best version of yourself? One small atomic habit at a time.
That's a fantastic question to ponder and a perfect note to end on, I think, because it is a reminder that even though we're talking about habits, it's not about these like rigid rules or restrictions. It's about empowerment, right? It's about recognizing that we actually have the power to shape our lives one small choice at a time. And that's what makes this whole journey so exciting. All right,